Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. I'm Carmel Martin. I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Action Fund. And really, thank you so much for joining us today for an exciting event on women's leadership. We've arrived at a moment that has the potential to be a pivotal time for women in American politics. In the past 6 months, we've had the first female candidate from a major political party run for the presidency of the United States and win the popular vote by a margin of nearly 3 million people. Although women in U.S. politics began 2017 with some pretty grim numbers, occupying less than 25% of elected offices at all levels of government, we also witnessed a historic women-led outpouring by progressives into the streets in the wake of Donald Trump's inauguration. And since then, we've seen a massive upsurge in the number of women who are coming forward to run for political office. Since the start of this year, more than 11,000 women have approached Emily's List to discuss their interest in running for office, compared to only 900 in the 2016 election cycle. And that brings us to the central point of today's event. Where do we go from here? How do we make the most of this unique moment of political resistance and progressive renewal and turn women's desire for office into electoral reality? We have to start by getting our facts straight. For too long, the conversation about women's political leadership in the U.S., by which I mean our striking lack of political parity at all levels of government, has been hamstrung by old ideas about what holds women back. We say that people aren't ready to accept women candidates or that women have less political ambition to run for office. But years of academic research and recent events we've all witnessed clearly indicate that these factors do not tell the whole story. In fact, they're a relatively small part of the story of why we don't have more women in political office. When women run, they win. According to the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, women were 28% of Democratic candidates for the U.S. House in the 2016 general election and 32% of Democratic winners. On the Senate side, women were 31% of Democratic candidates in the November election and 42% of winners. The problem isn't that voters won't elect women, it's that they aren't getting a chance to elect them because women are not making their way onto ballots. In the 2014 campaign season, the last year for which a full set of numbers is available, women were only 28% of candidates for federal, state, and local office in the United States. That same spring, women made up 29% of elected officials at the federal, state, and local levels, according to the Women Donors Network's Reflective Democracy campaign. Women are not getting onto ballots at the rate they need to in order to achieve political parity because of a whole array of forces having to do with recruitment, fundraising, and the support of political power brokers, or so-called gatekeepers, who are keeping them out. And those forces which favor insiders and incumbents keep women of color more sidelined still. Until we address and change the way our political power structures are built and operate, we won't be able to meaningfully address how to get women elected. And the goal of creating a truly reflective democracy, one that looks like and speaks of and to all of us, will remain out of reach. Our panelists today are going to give us a sense of the current landscape and talk about the sorts of concrete structural solutions that can open up the political universe to the most diverse range of women. But first, we're grateful to have with us two wonderful members of Congress that we have had the pleasure of working with over the years. Representative Pramila Jayapal is the first Indian American woman in the House of Representatives. She has spent the last 20 years working for women's, immigrant, civil, and human rights. We worked with her as a state senator and are so excited to welcome her to Congress this year. I'd also like to introduce Congresswoman Nanette Barragan from California. She, too, began her career this year in the House of Representatives. Born in Harbor City, California, she is the youngest of 11 children raised by immigrants from Mexico. She beat the odds and put herself through UCLA and USC Law School. They'll be joined by our moderator for today's event, Judith Warner, who is a senior fellow here at CAP Action and who put out a paper just last week, Opening the Gates, Clearing the Way for More Women to Hold Political Office. I urge you all to pick up a copy. So please join me in welcoming the Congresswoman and Judy to this stage.
Thank you all for coming out on this gray morning. It's great to see you all here today, and thank you, Congresswomen both, for being here for this conversation. I really appreciate it. The report, as Carmel said, is about opening the gates, looking at the structural barriers that are keeping women off ballots and out of office. Now, both of you were on ballots and are in office, so you are success stories. And I wonder, maybe we will start with the positive. What worked? To what do you ascribe the success that you've had so far? You both have very different stories of what led you into politics. When you look back on your stories, and if you were going to tell them to women who are interested in getting in, what do you see that carried you?
So for me, the first thing was I didn't allow somebody to tell me to wait my turn, because that's something that we are still having happen today. And when I got into the race for Congress, people literally called and said, somebody else was chosen for the seat. It's not your turn. Drop out. And so I think women, first of all, have to run. And most women have to be asked 7 times to run. So that's the first step, is making sure we're encouraging women to run. And for me, that was the first step forward. The second thing was fundraising. As much as we don't like to hear it, fundraising is necessary to get your message out. And that's the third thing you need. You need a message. And you need to be a good candidate. There are different types of candidates, and your story and your narrative really helps. I was running in a time where you had a very divisive presidential election. Donald Trump was dividing this country and was attacking immigrants and women and Mexican Americans. And I fit the category in all 3. So to be able to tell my personal story, to say that I was the daughter of immigrants from Mexico, my mom had only a 3rd grade education, and I beat the odds, was something that really resonated in my district and gave people hope. So at a time when there was so much division, people were looking for hope, and we provided that.
Well, I think, I never thought I would be in elected office. So I think that's the first thing I say to a lot of people is there isn't necessarily a path that everybody has to follow. And for me, I was an activist. Well, first of all, I was an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 16 years old by myself. My parents had about $5,000 in their bank account, and they used the whole thing to send me here because they felt like this was the place I was going to get the best education and have the most opportunity. And there were 3 professions I was supposed to be, a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. Politician was not one of them. And so it never really occurred to me that I should or could run. And then I really ended up in the activism world and started what is now the largest immigrant advocacy organization in the state. So I had 20 years of activism working for women's rights, for immigrant civil and human rights, as was said in the introduction. And I decided to run originally for the state Senate because I realized that after 20 years of trying to get other people to do the things that we felt should be done, that we really needed more of us in office. And more of us means more immigrants, more people that reflect the diversity of the country, more women. And so I ran for the state Senate, and I was the only woman of color in the state Senate in Washington state, which a lot of people think of as a very blue state. But not only are we dealing with the piece around gender, but we're dealing with the piece around race. And I think we've got to raise that over and over again. And so for me, the things that made it successful were, number one, I had a base. I had a really strong base. I had worked with all the labor unions. I had worked with all the women's organizations, all the progressive groups. I had a real standing in the immigrant and racial justice community. And all of those people were so excited to see me run. So it wasn't really a thing of having to collect names on a Rolodex. I had lived experience of working with people. And then the second thing was that on the fundraising side, I think if you have candidates who are exciting to the base, then people will give money. And I'm not just talking about the big donors, but for me, a big part of the success of my campaign was I had 83,000 donors across the country. And the average contribution was $23, excuse me, 27 was Bernie Sanders. We beat him with 23. And we raised almost $3 million. It was an incredibly expensive race for a non-swing district race. And both Nanette and I are in states that are top 2 states, which makes it very difficult for us because the Democratic Party doesn't get in for one candidate or another if you're running against another Democrat. So you're really kind of on your own with help from Emily's List and from other really important groups. But I think that was a big part of it too, is don't think of the way that things have been done as the only way that things can be done. Let's shake it up. Let's shake it up in terms of how we organize. Let's shake it up in terms of how we raise money. And then the third part of my success, I would say, was door knocking. And I love it. A lot of candidates don't, but to me, it is the way, this incredible privilege to spend 2 or 3 minutes on the door with somebody you've never met and have them tell you their deepest hopes and dreams and fears. So we knocked on 170,000 doors. We made over 280,000 phone calls. And there is no question in my mind that that is a huge part of why I won.
Just to return for a moment to the uniqueness of your states, your opponents were Democrats.
Correct.
all the way through.
Yeah.
And to return to that issue of being asked, all people need to be asked, more or less, to run. Women, research shows, need to be asked more, and they are asked less. Were either of you asked to run? And if so, repeatedly or not?
I was asked to run, but not by the power brokers, not by the gatekeepers. I was asked to run by people in my community and by leaders that I worked with every day. But I really was never, I don't think I was ever asked to run by anybody from the Democratic Party. I don't think I was ever asked to run by, sort of the people that manage the process.
I was asked to run by a member of Congress who said, I think this is a great opportunity. It's an open seat. And at first I said, thank you, but no thank you. The hardest thing for me to get over was how much money I would have to raise. Because I was a city council member in a city that was right outside of the district. So my base wasn't even in the district. And I did it the hard way. I didn't have that initial base that my colleague had. But I ended up quitting my job a year and a half out. I resigned my seat on the city council.
Just as you were mayor.
Exactly. To do this full time. And that was a commitment that I made that cost me a lot of money. I mean, I had to blow through my savings because I'm single. I had to take out a home equity line. So I was in this to win it. And I think that made the big difference for me because I had the party against me, the governor, the mayor, you name it. It truly was a race where my opponent was handpicked and was supposed to win. But we ignored all that and did, as my colleague mentioned, you go out, you raise your money, you focus on your message, you knock on your doors, and at the end of the day, it's going to be the voters that decide. And I think you have to keep that in mind when you're deciding to do this. It's going to be the voters.
You had a very intimidating list of people arrayed against you, in fact. I mean, the party, the lieutenant governor, the mayor, governor, 30 congressional Democrats got behind your opponent, and you did it. Clearly, this was an example of breaking past the gatekeepers. You had to deal with a hostile media as well. Do you think that being women of color, was behind some of that? Was it just that these were the expected anointed people who had sort of been in the works for a long time, your opponents? What was going on there?
We actually had the LA Times endorse me, and so the media in that sense was good, and that certainly helped, and we used it as much as we could. And I think that was somewhat of a turning point because we saw somebody who was in elected office, my opponent, who had a track record, and here you had two independent outlets effectively say my opponent was just good at winning elections, but doesn't mean it was going to be better at governing. And so it was harder as a female candidate because of the questions you get sometimes. You're set to a different standard. Women give, still today, women still contribute less money to women than they do to men sometimes. And so I think there's a challenge there. There's certainly, for me, I think it was a different dynamic. It was that a lot of people had worked with my colleague, rather with my opponent, and he was promised the seat. You know, he ran for the seat in 2012 and was told, if you drop out of the race, you'll be next in line next time. And that's why you had a rare opportunity in my race where there was only one guy really running. And then after I got in, we were the only two who raised any real money. At the end of the day, you had what you sometimes see is stacking of ballots. You had more women being added to the ballot, more people of color, Latino standing names. Even though none of these people opened a committee to raise money or spend money, it was merely to split the vote. And the strategy worked because in the primary, I only had about 21% of the vote, and he had about 40% of the vote. But when you then looked at the overall numbers, you see where the women were when you combine them, where you saw where Latinos were when you combine them, you saw a very different race.
Congresswoman Jayapal?
I think that, for me, we had 9 people in the primary. There was another, the person who ended up in the general with me was in the state legislature, would have been one of the youngest members of Congress had he been elected. And then we had somebody who had been in office since he was like 18 or something. I mean, he had been part of the Democratic Party machine. So he had a number of endorsements. A lot of people stayed out of our race too. But the media was challenging. I had sort of the opposite situation where the Seattle Times actually endorsed my opponent. And but our progressive paper, The Stranger, which is an alternative paper that probably has just as much weight as the Seattle Times, endorsed me, but not without controversy, because the person that I ran against in the general is a good guy. I mean, he's a progressive of Latino heritage, LGBTQ community. And so it was challenging. I found the media, though, to be particularly difficult in my race, and I found it in subtle ways. It wasn't always open, but there was an article that was done on all 3 major candidates during the primary, and for each of the 2 male candidates, I was the only woman in the race. For each of the 2 male candidates, they gave a long paragraph about their accomplishments in office. And for me, even though I had spent a long time on what I had accomplished, even though I was in the minority in the state Senate in just a first term, when it got to my profile, it said she's a vociferous debater on the floor, which to me, as a brown woman, says angry brown woman screams a lot, or something not that helpful. And so I called the reporter and said, I'm really curious what happened. And he said, Congresswoman, I feel, or state senator actually at the time, Senator, I feel so bad, but I had a paragraph in there about how unusual it was that you had accomplished what you had accomplished in your first term, and the editors cut it out. Wow. So that kind of thing happened quite a bit, and it's probably the first time I felt it so strongly, but it definitely operated, and I think it was both race and gender. But it was also the fact that I've been a really strong progressive advocate for a long time, and I've created challenges for people around things that matter to me, immigration, gender, racial equity.
And maybe it's a measure of the sort of opening up, the democratizing of media in the moment that we're in now. There was a lot of pushback online that was very visible and vocal. And did you encounter similarly kind of gendered or racialized language in the media? Well, you did have the support.
So it's interesting because I do want to distinguish. The editorial side of the Times was supportive, but I think you're right. On the news side, it was very different. Although my opponent was a sitting state legislator, he's got way more of the front runner and the accomplishments portion of it. So when she mentioned her story, it did ring a bell for me. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint what it's on in my race, whether it's because he was one of the most powerful state senators in California, and that could have been it. It could have been because people thought I had no chance. But you always certainly think about whether race and gender plays a role. My opponent did try to make our campaign about race, and so the race issue was always hanging over our race, and it was just a terrible thing because I started working in politics when I was in college in the Clinton White House, working in the Office of African American Outreach. And then I had a chance to go anywhere I wanted and went to go work with the NAACP on the Hill, working on racial and social justice issues, because I talk about the fact that racial profiling has happened to all of us. And if we combine together, we work together, we're way more likely to make progress. Yet, despite my track record, long before I ran for Congress, was trying to make it about race. So there was no doubt there was actually a local paper that was very close to my opponent. They actually held a fundraiser for him in their office. And they did an endorsement that was all along race, and it was just unfortunate. That was probably the toughest part of my campaign because of my track record. And it was unfortunate, and I think we just got to move away from that because people today will use it to try to divide us, and we have to really unite.
You mentioned how fundraising can be especially difficult for women, and you also just mentioned beforehand that you had a training program that was fantastic for that. And I'm wondering if it's just worth highlighting something like that, was that sort of something structural that allowed you to address a structural problem that gave you some help, if both of you have had some of those experiences with programs that were specifically helpful.
So before I ran for anything, and I've only run twice, once for city council and then once for Congress, I was told about Emily's List POP program, their political opportunity program. It's a one-day program. And I told a friend of mine, wherever the next session is happening, I'm going to it. And it turned out it was all the way in Philadelphia. But I got onto a plane and went. And it was one of the best programs I'd ever been to because it was very intense. And my favorite part of it was when they actually make you practice making a call. Because most candidates don't realize what you really do as a candidate, especially when you don't have a fundraising base, is you become a full-time fundraiser. I was in the call room Monday through Friday from 9 to 6, and that became my job. And I had a little glimpse of that when I did the program, and they make you practice, and you realize how hard it is to make the call and how hard it is really to make the ask. Because, look, I'm independent, I don't usually like to ask for help, and so calling and having the conversation is great. But then getting to the part where you have to ask somebody for money, it's not easy. It's not easy. It wasn't for me. I hear it's easier for men. Men will just say like, hey buddy, will you just get me $1,000, right? It was a very different dynamic.
I guess it sort of triggers all our vulnerabilities. Did you have similarly positive experiences?
Because I started my own nonprofit and had to raise tens of millions of dollars over 12 years for that nonprofit, I felt like I had done the fundraising thing and I wasn't afraid of it. But the reason I wasn't afraid of it did transfer over. In the beginning, I was uncomfortable because I felt like, wait, I'm asking for money for myself. But within just a week, I realized that it was actually the same philosophy as my nonprofit, which was, hey, you should be honored to give me money because I'm going to implement a vision. And if you believe in that vision, then that's what you're investing in. You're not giving money to me, you're giving money to the vision. And so the minute I had that in my head, it became easier. I think the only thing that I still find hard sometimes is, and every fundraiser will tell you this, you have to leave a gap when you ask the question. You have to allow for people to take in that question and then answer. And there's this uncomfortable set of moments that feels like it's 10 minutes, but it's actually probably 3 seconds, where you don't say anything, you've made your ask, may I have $5,400 please? And you've made your ask and you wait. And then that allows somebody to come in. If you try to fill that space, you really undermine your own fundraising because you don't give the opportunity for somebody. But I do think, with the greatest of humility, to be able to say, this is a chance to invest in our vision, and that's what you're selling, if you will. That's what you're offering. That's the way I try to help candidates who have never done fundraising before to think about it, because I think that changes it. It doesn't feel selfish. It feels like it's in service of what is good for our community.
I think that's a great place for us to turn to audience questions. I've let us run over a bit because I've so enjoyed listening to both of you. Are there any questions for the Congresswoman? Yes, in the back.
Hi there, my name is Ruthie. Talk pretty loud as well, but Thank you both for being here and for moderating as well. And this is a wonderful panel discussion. I think something I've been curious about, so in my studies within this past year, I've done a lot of reading on women running for office and really what it takes. And I read a lot of things that said that the initial ambition to run for office stems from a very early age, that if you did have an incentive later on to run, that it would come before your college years. So given that fact, maybe what do you guys think is the best way for that kind of like political socialization to happen early on, and to create these habits of like civic engagement happening with young girls?
If I can just piggyback on for a second, Congresswoman Jayapal, that did not happen for you, clearly. Did it happen for you, Congresswoman Berrigan?
I don't think it was really running for office. I think it was more of an instinct to fight for something. And because of my personal childhood background of my parents being immigrants, it felt like they were always fighting for something. And I remember my mother was the type of person that says, oh, we don't ask any questions, we do what we're told, we're just lucky to be here. And I was always the one that says, no, Mom, we have rights, we fight for things. And so that was the closest thing that I think I had early on when you see injustices happening within your community or amongst your family.
I think that might be changing too. I haven't seen that research that you're talking about, but for me, it definitely was not that way. I mean, I never thought about running, and people in my arena, as I said, would ask me to run, but I really felt like I was better on the outside as an activist and an organizer, and I never associated that with elected office as a platform for organizing, which is how I think about it now. And since I've run, I have found so many women, in particular women of color, who are so excited about that idea that you don't have to be in party politics since you were 16 or thinking about running since you were 16, but that you can think about whatever you did to benefit the community, whether it was as a small business owner or whether it was as an activist, as being the training that you need. And so I feel like a lot of that is changing, and a lot of the candidates that I'm supporting on the local level and the city, for city council, for state legislature, are people who have never thought about running for office until, say, the last 2 to 5 years. And I think Emily's List, I spoke at that training right after the Women's March, and it was amazing. I think that they are also seeing the same thing, that there are a lot of women who are feeling compelled and moved into action for political office by seeing people that they think are really incompetents and running for office and realizing, wait a second, I can do better than that. So I do think we're breaking down some of those barriers, and if that research exists and was true before, I wonder if we'll see something very different in the next 5 to 10 years.
And I think it's a good point because you never know what's going to trigger somebody to run. For me, I can tell you, when I first ran for city council, I was flipping through the channels and I saw a city council meeting in my local city. And I never watched a city council meeting before. And what I saw was a panel of all men and no people of color. And I was in front of my computer and I started to Google these guys and I said, they're not that impressive, I could do that. Right, so you never know what it will be.
I had that same exact feeling. I was not going to run for the state senate. People had asked me to run. I was like, no, I'm not going to run. And then I looked at the candidates one day, and I was like, this can't be. We need to have some better options here. And so that's also what got me to run.
That's great. That's such an empowering message because women do tend to underestimate their capabilities and their qualifications. Men tend to overestimate them. And the fact that you don't have to be on this trajectory to have been student council president from the age of 5 and sort of marched onward. It's great to know. Anyone else? Yes.
My name is Joanna Woodson. I'll be working soon with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. You're both obviously very confident and very well possessed. Do you ever feel fear or uncertainty, or when you were running, did you feel fear or uncertainty? And did you just kind of march through that if you did?
I can answer every single day. Every day I woke up and thought about I could lose, I will lose some days depending on how I was feeling. You know, there was some really, anybody who tells you it's all sunshine and roses is not telling you the truth. There's a lot of moments when you question yourself and you question what you're doing. You even question whether it's worth what you're feeling in order to run. But I think that I think of crisis as this amazing moment for strength to emerge. I think about that for organizing. The great moments that have brought us the civil rights movement or the right for women to vote or any of these major events that have happened in history have come out of crisis to some extent. And so I try to think about that from a personal level too, that it's an opportunity to just gird your loins. I really think that personal practice is important. So for me, that's breathing, it's meditation. You know, before I would go into a debate, I would often get nervous, and I would just spend 2 minutes. I would say, everyone out of the room, 2 minutes, do my little breathing meditation exercise, and just imagine where that strength comes from in you. Because I think for a lot of women, we're not used to having to think about that. We haven't really been encouraged to think of ourselves as powerful, but we are. We are so remarkably powerful. We just have to connect with that strength. And as corny as that sounds, I think it's a very important part of every day being able to make it through.
And that's you know, she's right on. You always have that fear. It depends on where that fear lies. For me, the big fear was I was giving up so much, and I knew that I was going to end up in debt. And for me, it was, is this worth taking a big calculated risk for? And my big fear was raising the money. Can I raise the money? And I think that was the hardest part for me to get over. But when it came to debates, as she mentioned, my fear was always, am I going to forget to say something I should have said? You know, you always go back and look at your answer and say, oh, I've left this part out. But the fundraising by far was my big fear, and personally where I was going to end up financially for making the decision to run.
Well, this is fantastic. Thank you so, so much. We're going to have to stop because we're out of time, but I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, I'm sure we have a lot to follow up on our wonderful Congresswoman. I'm going to quickly just introduce the members of the panel. I'm sure you have their bios, but just to put faces to names and to bios. Glinda Carr is the co-founder of Higher Heights, an organization building a national infrastructure to harness Black women's political power and leadership potential. Together with its sister organization, Higher Heights Leadership Fund, Higher Heights is investing in a long-term strategy to analyze, expand, and support Black women's leadership pipeline at all levels and strengthen their civic participation beyond just Election Day. And then Kate Black is with us. Kate is Chief of Staff at Emily's List, where she manages the strategic planning and implementation of Emily List goals and initiatives, handling a wide variety of political and institutional matters impacting the organization and its allies. She has a very long career in research and in working on electing women to political office. And Jessica Bird is the founder and principal strategist of 3 Point Strategies, a DC-based political consulting firm, executing strategic political programming for people of color candidates, campaigns, staff, and organizations. Jessica came out of Emily's List, where she founded the first ever homegrown candidate recruitment program and has worked on campaigns in 43 states. If that's still accurate, if there are even more now. That's maybe. Thank you all for being here this morning and continuing this really, really important conversation. Kate, I'm going to just start with you. The big headline right now is all of these women who have come forward in the wake of the election and in the wake of the Women's March or marches to want to run for office. So can you tell us about that, the numbers and who they are?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me and for this great panel. So the number, it was said earlier, we're actually at 13,000. Over 13,000 women have come to Emily's List since Election Day, saying that they want to run. We have an additional 7,000 women who have come to us and said, we want to help a woman run. Post-Election Day, Emily's List has really decided that there are kind of two lanes that you can operate in. If you're a woman, you can run for office, or you can help a woman run. And we're seeing really record numbers of women and men step up in both of those lanes. You know, as part of this conversation, one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge is certainly after Election Day, women have been leading this resistance movement, but they've also been leading movements, especially resistance movements, before Election Day as well. And I think that's really important. We are certainly seeing women organize in marches. We're seeing them step up at airports. 86% of the calls into Congress defending the ACA were from women. And now we're seeing them run for office, which is really inspiring, but not that surprising. Women usually run for office when they're either angry or they want to see change in their community. And I think especially after Election Day, women are seeing both of those things happen.
What does that mean to have 13,000 women come forward, though, concretely? Like, where do they go? What do you do with them? What races do you put them in?
That's a great question. So we created a new program for Emily's List called Run to Win. And really, we are certainly, as the last panel described, training women. We just launched our 2017 training calendar, where we're training in over 20 states. We hosted a training the day after the Women's March for 500 women here in DC. So we're really broadening our training curriculum this year and next year, but we're also wanting to make sure that they're running in races that they can win. So we're reaching out to them with a variety of online tools. We're telling them when we're coming into their communities, and we're building out our staff across states so that we can engage with them in real ways. You know, we don't just want you to run, we want you to run to win, which is why the program is called what it is.
So, Linda, your organization has been focusing on doing a deep dive with a certain number of candidates, supporting them deeply, structurally, beginning to end. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So Higher Heights is a national organization building the collective political power of Black women by harnessing their economic, electoral, and organizing power to do three things: to advance progressive politics, elect Black women, and to influence election. One thing, when we woke up on November 9th, you know, depending on where you were, you know, many of us woke up upset. But the one thing that did happen when you look at the data on November 8th was that Black women continue to move this country forward by being one of the center blocks of the foundation of a winning coalition, and voted overwhelmingly to move this country forward by voting for Hillary Clinton by over 94%. Even though Black turnout was lower in 16, we continue to be this viable voting bloc. But also on November 8th, Black women and women of color broke through at a time where this country, progressives lost from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket across the country. Women of color broke through. We have the largest number of women of color serving in Congress. Higher Heights looks at a lens, obviously, at African American women. We have the largest number of African American women serving in Congress. We elected the first Black woman to serve in the Senate for more than 20 years, but you also had these amazing breakthroughs across the country of Black women running and winning at state legislative levels, a record number of Black women running for prosecutors across the country and winning, from Kim Foxx in Illinois to Attica Scott, who was the first woman to serve in the Kentucky legislature in 20 years. So that being said, there is a growing opportunity to train, support, and elect Black women across this country. So Higher Heights wants to take and harness that power to ensure that we are creating an environment for Black women to succeed as candidates. So that is preparing and continuing to work with our allies like Emily's List and Emerge to ensure that there are broad-based trainings, but also for us, our 2020 strategy is how do we get women prepared, a cohort of women that are running for the first time or in a cohort of women that ought to be running for higher office. So Linda Lake did a research years ago now that said that women, when they run for office, they don't even think about running for a higher office. Meanwhile, our male counterparts have mapped out a three-pronged approach of, I'm going to run for dog catcher, but I'm going to be president. So how do we ensure that the progressive champion women that we have across the country literally identifying saying you should run for mayor? So currently there are 8 women of color that are mayors of major cities. 5 of them are black women. 1 of them is a Latina, and then 2 are Asian. So the question becomes, that's been a recent increase. Black women, in 2014, there was only 1 black woman mayor, and that was in Baltimore. Baltimore is interesting. There have been 3 successive women mayors of Baltimore. And in 2 cycles, we've gone from 1 black woman to 5 black women. So there's a real opportunity to talk about black women not only serving in districts that look like them, but the fact that black women can break through and represent all populations. But it's about providing her the training, but more importantly, the support. And then for us in the conversation, in context of the conversation this afternoon, how do we break down those gates that are holding back these amazing black women that should be serving?
Which brings me to Jessica. You're on the ground, you're involved in races in cities now, and you are experiencing a lot of frustration in this moment that's painted as a moment of great hope and potential and all these women coming forward and, yay. You're kind of not seeing it play out on the ground like that. Can you talk about that?
No, right. So I think that this is a both and question. It's so exciting that people are feeling such righteous anger that they would raise their hand, or this incredible opportunity. But the and is that what happens when we get them 50,000 foot in the air and we ask them to run? What we heard from these congresswomen before, which was so resonant for me, is that when women, and especially women of color, run, they run in primaries. And so we got to choose a side. And I think that my experience on the ground is that we're not willing to do that. We're not willing to say that race equity means something enough for us to get into a race where there's an incumbent, or to get into a race where there is a non-person of color running, or get into a race where there's a man running. And so, I think that when I think about this football field full of women, I think this is awesome, and now we got to play the game. And for me, if on November 9th, you're a progressive organization or an entity who did not look at your endorsement process, who isn't willing to change the systems inside of your organization to make it so that race equity is central to your work, if you're a progressive organization that still sees money as the most viable measurement of whether a person can run, if you are an organization that is still thinking and has a staff of upper middle class white people as your main people who are driving the strategy of your organization, then you are not only complicit in helping to sustain the system, but you are preventing women of color and new types of leaders from running for office. And if you say that you're a part of the resistance, I hate to tell you that that's actually not resistance. When you're unwilling to look at the structure inside your organization and change that to open these floodgates, then essentially you're complicit in the pain of black and brown people, which is what this entire election was about anyways.
Can you give me a concrete example of how you saw this play out on the ground? And Glenda, I know we've talked about this. I think we'll talk about the same case. So.
Yeah, sure. And then I think this will get to some of these structures, right? So one race that Glenda and I were really invested in was the St. Louis mayoral race. There was a woman running whose name is Tashara Jones. She was the city treasurer of St. Louis. She's been elected 4 or 5 years. And in 2016, the current mayor of St. Louis, who had been mayor for 20 years, said that he wasn't going to run. Yay, open seat. That's where people of color and women typically win. And in the last 3 years, we've seen this incredible uprising that really was anchored in Ferguson, Missouri, just blocks away from St. Louis proper, that really changed the world. It catalyzed a Black Lives Matter movement that really has changed all of the ways in which we think about criminal justice and the intersection of electoral politics. And so Tashara had been on the ground in that city and also with activists for the last 3 years. Raised her hand to run in the open seat for mayor, and there were 5 additional black candidates, 1 white woman candidate who essentially the current mayor had handpicked and said would endorse. And so it really started to be clear that there were going to be silos around, or really a split ticket around who could win in the St. Louis mayor's race. But activists time and time again said that they chose Tashara, that Tashara was best for the city at the time, that she could run and lead on issues that they cared about, and that they were going to be mobilizing a black base in the city of St. Louis, which is overwhelmingly black population, in order to make that happen. Only 2 national organizations got in the race for St. Louis mayor, citing that there were too many women candidates or too many black candidates. Tashara raised $300,000 to an opponent who spent $1.3 million. She had an entirely field program that was really catalyzed by the black activists who were a part of this burgeoning civil rights movement in St. Louis, and she lost by 888 votes. And there are a couple of things systemically that I think about, and then I totally want you to jump in, Glinda, one is that in a majority Democratic city, if that would have been a top 2 election, Tashara could have advanced in the primary and run in a general election, potentially being able to raise more money. So that's a systemic barrier. And then additionally, when we talk about money being as important as it is in these elections, the unwillingness of organizations to not listen to activists who are saying what they want and what they need means that only 30% of the city chose the current mayor, while 67% of the city chose a black candidate. So that is an inherently racist decision to say that you are willing to sit out of a race in which black people are saying the only way for us to get a reflective candidate is when you get in.
Well, I also think when we look at this from a progressive lens, it cannot just be about swing states, right? So most of our progressive money goes towards flipping houses, trying to flip Washington, when ultimately if we're trying to change the very landscape of our country, we have to look at our city halls and our state legislatures across the country. So we need to make mayors sexy, right? This wasn't a race that people were like, oh, everybody was concerned and fixated about Ferguson, which is literally, 10 minutes from St. Louis. Why do we care about St. Louis? Why do we care about Cincinnati? Why do we care about these major cities, Detroit? They changed the very landscape of our country. So that being said, we have to have, strong conversations about where are we going to create a progressive infrastructure and where that money is going to go. And more importantly, if we're going to change the face of leadership and create pipelines so that I can envision a black woman in the White House, you have to create pipelines at the local level. So Higher Heights endorsed Tashara Jones. We've also endorsed Yvette Simpson for Cincinnati, which is another race to look at in the same dynamic. Here is a woman that was also outspent 4-1, running against an incumbent. So by clear, from a gatekeeper perspective, there's no reason why she was ever supposed to be in that race. She's the sitting city council president, got in a race where everybody said she shouldn't be in the race, and actually won. Well, it's the top 2 vote getters go to the November election. She actually won that first primary 11 points above the sitting incumbent. With little to no money, with little to no national infrastructure or gatekeepers coming in to support her. So there are some real opportunities to create a pipeline for women of color candidates if indeed infrastructure from our gatekeepers, our party system, as well as our progressive institutions really decide to deep invest in a long-term strategy to reshape the face of leadership and quickly. And I don't know if you're going to talk about this later, but I'll quickly throw out there. So therefore, we need to have a conversation about gatekeepers and our political parties.
That's what I will break in for a moment, just to say, Kate, Emily's List began as a disruptor, if that word had been used in the mid-1980s, which it wasn't, and has now become a gatekeeper, even though you're still trying to shake things up. But a lot of these kinds of criticisms do, end up coming the way of Emily's List. So how do you, and in your heart, of course, your heart is with all of this, right? So how do you get there? How do you respond, let's say, and how does it, what has now become a big, powerful organization like Emily's List, how do you make this next step to become truly diverse?
Sure. Well, I think, I disagree with the notion that Emily's List is a gatekeeper in the sense that you're exactly right. We were started in 1985 as an anti-establishment organization. And there are times in which we work with the political party system, but as we saw last year through many primaries, some in our backyard, we work right against that party system, and we are constantly trying to make sure that when those fast recruiting conversations happen, like you mentioned in your paper, when we're looking at primaries, that we are actively pushing the political system to look at women of color, and make sure that we're a part of that conversation. I think as we look forward to our 2018 cycle, we are looking at more House races than ever before. Thanks to Donald Trump, I think a lot of Republican incumbents are vulnerable, and I think there are some great women and women of color to take them on. I think we're also looking at a few rare Senate opportunities. And I think also when it comes to governors, we are really expanding our state and local programs so that we can possibly have more women running for governor than ever before, as well as looking at mayors. I think mayors is such an important conversation. That is really a gateway into executive leadership. And so as Emily's List is making some hard decisions about where we can get in and where we can be supportive, I know that mayors and state and local are going to be a big part of that moving forward.
What is the kind of really concrete organizational change that you can envision for progressive organizations to get basically where we all need to go? And are there examples where you feel that organizations have changed themselves internally and that it has really borne fruit?
Three pieces, because I do think we need to change the face of, as you're talking about change the face of leadership, we also have to change the face of our gatekeepers. So one, from the institutional perspective, we have to have hard conversations, and it's one of the things that we talked about. We were at an exchange right after the election abroad, is do our institutions reflect, if we're talking about reflective democracy, does our internal institutions reflect what we want externally? So not only, your staff, does it represent the population that we want this country to look like? And in very incidents, to be hard, many of our institutions are very white at the top, and our boards of directors are very white. So we have to have very clear conversations about there are amazing people of color, women of color that ought to be filling those roles, but also could be stepping into the roles of being in these board of directors roles. In addition to that, changing the face of gatekeepers and the ability to push our allies to reconsider how we are looking about a long-term and short-term strategy is that there are an increase in number of people-led institutions like Higher Heights, the New American Project, Latino Victory Fund, Collective PAC, and Black PAC that are doing this work to, one, be a integral part of the ecosystem around ensuring that there's pathways for people of color to run and win, but also deep diving and investing in creating a stronger stewardship of donors of color and operatives of color to support our own candidates and fund our candidates from a very organic, indigenous perspective.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important question because it also gets to the heart of what a winning strategy is. The truth is that the formula to both win elections, the formula to recruit, the formula to run an election has changed because our country is changing. And so as our demographics have exploded and created way for what we know is a new American majority, which is do not take the term majority lightly. We have a coalition of people of color and white progressives that could win in elections all over the country if we engaged our base. And that base is engaged when they have culturally competent messengers and people who are talking about the progressive issues that they truly care about. One of the reasons that I feel that we lost in November is because of a feeling that people weren't being talked directly to about the issues that they cared about with messengers that they could see themselves reflected in. And so that means our formula has to change. We can no longer only think about viability in a few ways. And so just to go back to a couple of things that I mentioned before and to answer the question around what can we be doing is we have to entirely change the way that we think about what's winning and what isn't. When you engage a base, when you have a field program that is vibrant and exciting, where voters are excited to hear from their candidate, that means that the way that you think about your budget and TV commercials and all of the fancy, sexy stuff that makes a lot of people in DC a lot of money, but actually doesn't resonate with people on the ground, then you actually need to start thinking about that and how you think about whether that candidate can win. And then I just think our endorsement processes have to be completely turned upside down. We are asking questions that if we ask them in a job interview, I actually think would be illegal. You know, we ask so much about what a person makes, how much they're going to be able to raise, you know, who their community is, who they know, who their grandfather is. I mean, these are things that my candidates on the ground are truly being asked. And so that is a boulder in the path of what we say that we want, which is a reflective democracy and also new types of leaders who, if it's about being able to take out a home loan in order to run for office, as we heard before, like, we should have a huge problem with that. That made me so uncomfortable to hear that she had to take out a home equity loan. That is unfair and it's unjust.
Have you seen organizations do the kind of soul searching you're talking about with these goals and then act accordingly?
Yeah. I'm really excited about the way that Democracy for America is engaging in race equity work at the state and local level. They're not only are they willing to get in primaries, but they are engaged with activists on the ground to really think about what a winning strategy could be when there's a mobilized base. I'm also really excited about the Collective PAC, which is a new political action committee specifically focused on electing Black people, and so they also get into primaries. We know that Higher Heights gets into primaries for Black women, but they also get into primaries where there are Black men running, which is a very, that's another, right? When you are at the intersection of race and gender and even class, and it's all falling on your head, and there's no one who's ever willing to say, actually, it's you, let me pull you out of that rubble, then of course you're gonna be buried underneath those systemic pieces. But when there are organizations who are like, actually, it's clear that if I were to move this out of the way, that you could win and you could access power, like, I just swoon.
Linda and Kate, the meeting that you were at overseas last winter, I believe in Belgium, was sort of a transatlantic conversation about structural change. And I'm wondering if there were any lessons from abroad that you found were applicable in this context.
So I think I think we were all got invited.
I'm sorry, you were there too.
Oh, were you there too?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think we got that invitation maybe a month before the election,
Yes.
and the conversation was geared around, let's talk about women's leadership, and I thought, great. 2 weeks after Election Day, I'm like talking about women's leadership after hopefully we would have won the presidential. That sounded awesome.
Yeah, in Belgium, eating waffles, like, for sure.
It was a different kind of trip.
Yes.
It was a different kind of trip, and actually, it was a trip that I was a little anxious about how it would feel. Being in that room and having some of those conversations was really one of the things that I think was most healing for me. Also, being out of the United States at that point as well. But I think hearing from our colleagues who have put in some really institutionalized measures to elect more women was helpful. I think it challenged some of my own assumptions about what's possible in our own country. And I think one of the things in your paper that you identify is membership organizations or party structures themselves having some targets about the percentage of women and women of color that they recruit and spend money on, I think is one of the things that we should be open to discussing. It is not an anathema for our party system to have some sort of target. The Democratic Party has a 50% women, 50% men target for all delegates. The Republicans even have some measures for this too. So I think that trip helped me kind of break out of my own silo a little bit and really think critically about what could be possible as we look forward. So often I think we find ourselves in the race that we're running right now. And this is not really a marathon. I think it's a relay race.
And so often we find ourselves set in thinking this is the only way we can do it in the U.S. But the idea that, I mean, speaking to you before and after, that there is that kind of flexibility and possibility is great. And what did you both think?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's one of the reasons why it's important to talk about systems, because I think that in the United States, I find that we end at the symbolic nature of how good it feels to have done a thing, that it makes us more look as though we are more diverse. And what the conversation that we engaged in there was about literally how do you disrupt and intervene in a system that wasn't designed for some of us to lead. You know, it wasn't, we literally are operating within, like, we are supposed to be losing. That's how the system is designed right now. And so our job is to intervene and to disrupt that. And so the way that folks have found, across the world is by creating ranked choice voting systems, by saying that we need quotas. We literally have to disrupt the way that this works. So like we need numbers to measure our success. And that really challenged the US delegation, because we are so inside of this process and we've been trained in a very particular way. And so it's really, the onus is on all of us. And I've had to shed this skin for myself as well as an operative, is to say, actually, you are doing something that not only has never been done before, but isn't supposed to happen. And so if that's true, then you have to completely reimagine what is possible inside of this work.
For me, traveling that far after, it was cathartic for one. I think the U.S. delegation were just like, help, hug us. But for me, since our work, our lens is gender and our lens is also racial, is to have seen the racial disparities of the women that attended that were part of the African diaspora. The fact that even though there are quotas and they are much further ahead than we are in the EU, is that the black women, and they were young black women, they're still feeling that they were underrepresented and underserved. They did this great panel of 4 black women that are serving from city councils to their legislators. They are women that defy the odds, that they shouldn't be elected. So the notion that there is so much work to be done from a racial and gender lens fueled my ability to kind of come back and reset and determine how can we look at systems. And for Higher Heights, we've been looking and having conversations around particularly the Democratic National Committee. Here is a committee where, again, black women are the foundation of a winning coalition from a voting perspective, yet and still we are underrepresented in leadership. This past weekend, so there's one black woman that was elected this year, Karen Clark Peterson, who is also, she was elected vice president of the DNC. She's also the chair of her state party. There are actually only 2 black women that serve in as a chair of a state party. When you're talking about having decisions about if we're looking at quota systems or system changes, if black women aren't in leadership in the party, both the Republicans and Democrats, it'll be hard to push a discussion about diversity. This past weekend, California voted for their next chair. Here's a state, it is the largest Democratic Party in the country. They had 3,300 delegates. I can't imagine what that voting was.
Yeah.
There was an African-American woman running in that race. She was considered an outsider. She hadn't moved up the rank the way that it was perceived she should move up the rank, that she shouldn't have won. She ended up raising $500,000 for this state party chair. I know, $500,000. And she came 63 votes from winning. My understanding as last night, she hasn't conceded and is asking for a revote. That may have changed over the last 24 hours, but that close. In a state where African Americans are less than 7%, that you had this black woman saying, hey, I'm gonna run like a white man. And I'm going to step out, I'm gonna run, I'm gonna raise money, and I'm gonna be bold. That is the type of leadership that we need, truthfully, on both parties, to have women of color saying, we're going to step out and run for these party leadership roles so that we can change the system and open up the gates.
Ask about an unofficial gatekeeper, which is the media, which I've heard described in a number of situations, really kind of play a gatekeeper role in framing how the public approaches a candidate, understands a candidate, what are the tropes that are used basically to frame and encapsulate who the person is. And Kate, your research, you've done a lot of opinion research and over time, and I think that you would confirm that voter attitudes have changed a lot over the decades, but we see a lot of the old tropes and the old attitudes still coming through in the media. I wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that certainly some newer research has shown that looking at the media kind of landscape as it pertains to men and women candidates, there's a perception sometimes among women candidates when they see an election like we just had in 2016 that was rife with both implicit and implicit misogyny, that if they take on a run for whatever level it is, that they will feel that level of sexism. Newer research looking at how media covered House races in both 2010 and 2014 really showed that there was no difference. There was really no sexism that was, I mean, not to say there was no, because there always is. Because if there wasn't sexism or misogyny as part of our culture, then electing women would be easier. But certainly the level that women might perceive it to exist is not. And rather voters, because our politics have become so partisan and so divided, that voters sometimes are more likely to care if you are a Democrat or a Republican than you are a woman or a man. And the coverage that you receive in your campaign sometimes is more biased towards your partisanship than it is your gender. Now, of course, I think there are examples, and we all know them, and I think we certainly want to prepare candidates as they engage in their campaigns. We want to prepare them so that they're having a conversation with their voters about the issues that matter, so that when anything from fake news to sexist attacks to trolls on Twitter come at you, that you are prepared and that your voters know your story.
And I'm wondering if this is one of those answers that's different maybe for women of color, maybe in local elections particularly, I'm not sure, with local media as opposed to national media. But because I'm familiar with that research and it is very solid research, but I also know that it's true and can think of concrete examples for the races involving women of color. So
Absolutely, yeah.
I would love to jump in. I mean, it makes me sad that right now that fake news is such a thing, because it makes us defend journalists in a way that's so vehement when there actually should be a nuanced and important conversation around the way that we tell stories about candidates right now. And because our president has really exploited this moment to talk about the way that media is attacking him, I have found it a lot harder to talk about the way that media attacks and is used as a gatekeeper in local elections. I've never worked with a woman of color candidate who hasn't been unfairly attacked or unfairly characterized by their local newspaper. Not one, ever. So much so that it is become a trope or become a part of the way that we train around running for office and the way that you engage as a candidate. Media oftentimes in local elections will use the worst, ugliest, most unflattering photo of the candidate possible, although their incumbent opponent is usually looking valiant and and like a savior and like he's born for the job. I've never worked with a Black woman in particular who wasn't called difficult, who wasn't called hard to work with, who wasn't seen as not a team player. I've never worked with a woman of color who didn't have a question in particular about why now and why she was qualified in ways that were overtly racist. And I've never worked with a mom who her motherhood wasn't questioned, and in particular, Black women who are unmarried, asked about whether or not they were a single parent in the insinuation of the welfare queen tropes that we know have really characterized Black women and our proximity to economics in this country. And so we have a real problem. We have a real problem with media as gatekeepers at the local level. And what it takes, just to give a quick example, Tashara Jones, who we talked about earlier, who ran in St. Louis, was unfairly attacked by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for the entirety of her race, so much so that when she was asked to give an editorial board interview at that point, she was so exhausted and really knew that it was a setup for the additional racist, sexist, classist questions that they had been asking her the entire trail, that she wrote a public-facing letter about exactly why she was going to decline the interview. That letter really nationalized the race because people were so excited that she told the truth. The reason that Tashara was able to tell the truth is that she had a catalyzed base and she had a mobilized field engagement program that could make sure that that paper then couldn't continue to attack her, but that they were going to talk to voters on the doors. Unfortunately, not every candidate has that beautiful alchemy.
That letter, though, led to a really remarkable slapdown, and slapdown is the word, I mean, by the editorial board afterwards,
Right.
where literally after she lost the election by 888 votes, they said, well, maybe if she had been a bit more humble, this wouldn't have happened.
That's right.
Yeah. Linda, are you seeing this too?
Yes, and I also think the media not creating creating a space where there's an environment for women to succeed. There is a lot of conversation and coverage around, obviously, the increase in women wanting to run for office, but I do think there's a secondary messaging around women of color that is missing. And then the notion it's okay to go, we need more women, but when you start talking about women of color, well, why women of color? That secondary message about the equal importance of the diversity within the gender, I think, is missed, and it's a real missed opportunity for not only our new media gatekeepers, but our traditional media to really talk about. There's research, happy that you've put out some additional research about the importance of having women and women of color at decision-making tables, because those decision-making tables are proven by research being better decision-making tables when women from across the aisle are sitting at those tables. And then the fact that we don't want to go from a table of all white men to a table of all white women, and that the diversity of what that table is designed is important for this country.
Yes, a couple final questions for all three of you. Right now, it's supposed to take over 100 years for us to reach parity, just women and men, in Congress. Let's say we were able to have that happen in 25 years, 30 years, and it not just be a slate of all white women. Mm-hmm. What will have happened? What is necessary to make that happen? What are the steps? And why don't you just come in?
I think that when we alleviate some of the economic barriers by providing fellowships and jobs for people who are running for office and can't afford to not be paid at that time, I think that we have to get really creative about our economic interventions for the people that we believe should run. I believe that when we figure out our election systems and take seriously whether or not we deserve and need ranked choice voting and top two, especially in places where there are majority people of color. I think that when we think about money in elections and don't just focus on, how much you can spend on a TV commercial. And I just think that we need a deep, deep, deep race and gender equity lens in all of our work. And we have to bring that center, bring the identities of the people who live at the margins into the center and start with them and not end with them.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I would also add, one of the things that we look at Emily's List is certainly if we're ever going to have parity, Republicans have to do their part. That is just how math works. We can only do so much. And so I would encourage the Republican Party not only to think about making women and women of color a priority, but also probably policies that also benefit and don't harm women. I would also add to Jessica's point, and to the point that was, I think, made earlier about kind of early political engagement. I think really pushing back on voter suppression laws across states is critical, so that when people want to start with that very first political engagement, possibly about voting, that they are able to without penalty or suppression, and can do that.
I should have went first. And I actually deferred. I was like, go, Jessica. So I echo my colleagues. I also believe that I'll start with we need to reshape the narrative about women in leadership. Our report that we co-authored with the Center for American Women in Politics, the status of Black women in American politics, it speaks to that Black women are inspired to run for office when they see someone else, the role modeling effect. So if our media, if we're not telling our stories about the pathway to leadership and the impact of what diverse leadership is, we're not creating the actual momentum for more women to see themselves in those roles and being very bold and aggressive to step into that leadership. And then ultimately, we currently live in a political infrastructure and system that money matters in elections, and that not only do we need to hold the current donors accountable for being very strategic about expanding where their money is going and where it's supporting, but we also live in a country where we can increase the number of donors, particularly when we look at donors of color. How do we shift, and I'll use African American women as an example because that's the lens that I work in. Black women move over $5 billion a year. If we just shifted some of that dollars to our political and stewardship, we can fund our own candidates and fund them very early in a very significant way. But it's reshaping the narrative about, the dark money and the notion. I have friends myself, my own friends are like, I don't want to give, money that's dirty money. How do we reshape that? It's an investment in your community, and an investment in your an investment in our nation, in giving up that pair of shoes or that brunch or a day out with your friends really can change what this country looks like from a political perspective.
That's a really great place to stop. And I know people are going to have questions. We don't have a lot of time left. Yes.
Morning, and thank you all for being here. So my name is China Dickerson, and I work at NARAL Pro-Choice America. And actually, our chapter in Missouri endorsed Tashara, and our national president then went down for one of the canvases. And that's because, so my question is going to go to primaries. The people on the ground, as Jessica mentioned, wanted Tashara. And so we're here in DC, so we listened to them. So I think one of the biggest things that we do have to have a conversation around is primaries. And so my question for the panel is, how do we convince the gatekeepers or the establishment that primaries is the way? Democrats have to engage in primaries in order to see more diversity on the state, local, and federal levels.
Great question.
Beat them. I mean, that's how we're going to win. And it's such a good question. And you're right, I should have shouted out NARAL, because NARAL actually had an incredible program in St. Louis, Missouri. So thank you all for that. We have to win races. And this is what I tell candidates, and I'm working right now with the Movement for Black Lives, is when we start winning, people will start to shift the way that they engage in elections, because people, and in particular DC, care about power. And so in order to shake what they believe, gatekeepers, their whole job is to protect the power that's inside, the power that they have. And so we got to take some of that power in order to, or at least distribute it differently. And then I believe that we're going to start to, winning races right now with a few $100,000 against $1.3 million, like, folks are going to learn.
Yeah, I would also echo. I mean, I think Emily's List is always engaged in primaries. We know that electing women in safe Democratic seats is a great way to increase our representation. I think 2016, we played in a lot of primaries where we were successful. Both women who were on the stage earlier were in primaries functionally their entire campaigns, and Emily's List got in with them very early. We also got in some primaries last year where we didn't win. And that was not an easy thing, but it also reminded, I think, the folks in our office and outside of our office why what we do is so important. We are in the business of electing women, and we can't apologize for that. It is the thing that we ask money for, it's the thing that we spend money on, and it's the thing that we're going to keep doing.
I think we need to be data-driven in creating a long-term strategy and having those conversations with local allies. The data points to the fact that if you are looking at preparing and running and supporting women of color, that is a winning strategy, both from a on the ballot perspective, but also an opportunity to create enthusiasm among an electorate that will help support the ballot from the bottom of the ticket to the top of the ticket. We often, I think, just based on the nature of politics, are jumping into races as the races are happening versus going, what does a blueprint map look like for this country over the next 10 years and actually starting to prepare a woman of color that will be running in 4 years or 5 years, and creating the political environment. So having conversations with local gatekeepers, local activists, the electorate, and preparing her effectively to run, that in the out years, we actually can create a cyclone effect where we can be electing more women quicker because we've done the groundwork 2 elections out, versus everyone going, oh, here's this race, everybody run. We're going to work on this race. Oh, there's a race in another 6 months, let's all go run. And it at times works, but because there's no actual long-term strategy where we all as partners can then layer on what each one of us are going to do, that we're losing real opportunities. And unfortunately, as you know, particularly for women, oftentimes when women run and they lose, they don't run again. Again, our male counterparts will continue to run 10 times and dust themselves off. So we're missing some real opportunities where we lose women that decide they're not going to run again because we haven't created this like real strong data-driven strategy.
So my question's a bit of a two-parter. First question being, was there any research actually out there now that presents people of color, specifically women of color, who run in districts that are not majority minority, and how they should run? There's research out there about just generally how women should run, but obviously we know the dynamic of race factoring into that plays a big role. Some folks say, like, you shouldn't talk about it, really, like, focus too much on, like, racial issues or anything that kind of plays too much into that because, like, you know, that'll scare the white people, quite frankly. It's sort of like the popular thought out there. The second question is, how do you, deal with the fact that you have majority minority districts? I have one in my state, I'm in Virginia. And, last year there was an expectation that if Kane had won the UP nomination, that guy was going to move up to run for U.S. Senate. There was like 30 black people in line. It's the only district that has majority black people, but black people all over the state in Virginia. And so what has been done in a lot of these organizations to sort of push that, black people shouldn't be siloed anymore into just running where there are predominantly communities of color?
Let's start with Glinda, because you're always.
So there's no recent research that I know of that speaks to that. Barbara Lee's Families Foundation has done a bunch of research, has done it across race, and has some crosstabs around voters' perceptions about candidates of color. So that would be where I would say, if you're looking for a deep dive in some of the research that's out there in the atmosphere, that I would point to the work that she's done there. I wholeheartedly agree. I am a person that does not do not ever want to run for office, but when I'm at tables talking about strategy, I am always there going, do not pigeonhole me to that I can only run in communities that look like me. Because then that cuts off my pipeline, which means you're telling me I can never run statewide and I can by all means never run nationally. So I think we need to, again, reshape the narrative about women being that Shirley Chisholm unbought and unbossed leadership that this country needs at this time, and that means we need to invest in that woman in districts outside of what we've historically kind of pigeonholed candidates of color, going, well, that's a Latino district, that's a black district, because we are missing out on opportunities, one, to build that national pipeline, but also an opportunity to expand the number of women that are running, because we're not just going, oh, well, you're running for this safe black seat, so therefore we're not putting any money in this race.
Yep, I would also echo the Barbara Lee research. I think it's really well done. I think we're in a different space and time though, and I think having some newer research is helpful. So if anyone in the room wants to do that research, come talk to us. I think Glinda's point is exactly right, and I think one of the other things that I've been thinking a lot about is, as current elected officials are thinking about either running for higher office or retirement, what is their what woman are they looking to, either at the level under them that they want to help pull up, and especially how can we be helpful in that conversation to make sure that everyone's doing the political work that they need to, so that we eliminate this notion of turns. There are no turns in this business. It's elections. So I think that's a key part of what I've been thinking about as well.
Okay, great. Is there any other question? I know we're a little over. Yes. We started late, so.
Hi, my name is Wen. I work for Congresswoman Susan Davis. So you guys talked about making women more impressionable, engaging with the base, and just more sexy for the role, right? To grab people's attention. So any advice for women who are more introverted? Because Susan Davis, she's very introverted. She wasn't supposed to win the seat, but she's been continuing to get reelected every single year. So how do we get more introverted women, more shy women who do have the passion to break the system and to bring down the barriers into office?
I think it's a good question, but I don't. We didn't say impressionable or sexy when running for office. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Just because I think that that's really important.
I say if you're an introverted, run for office. I mean, I think there are skills that you can learn, and there are trainings and people like Jessica and Glinda who work with candidates every day. To run for office, you need a passion to run and lead. You need the willingness to work long hours, and you need to like people. And I'm not saying you need to be extroverted. I'm not saying you have to be comfortable in public speaking. But I am saying you need to be willing to do some things.
Yeah.
You can learn a lot in running for office about yourself. You don't need to be outgoing in any way.
Absolutely not. Yeah, I want to make mayors' races sexy. Mayors don't have to be sexy. I think that part of this too is that an election is hiring a person for a job, and so the person who's going to be your city councilor, the person who's going to be your treasurer, your county executive, that has a job responsibility that you need to make sure that person is not only qualified for, but also wants to do. And so oftentimes we get mired in what it looks like for a person to lead in a specific powerful way, and not actually that they're applying to be in a specific position. So totally agreed that this is about whether you are qualified for that job. And I would say, the reason you should have a base is so that they can see and hear you, even when you're not the loudest one, even when you don't look historically like a person who's had that position.
Well, a lot of introverts come to life on the public stage, too. Well, this is wonderful. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for coming out today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.